Livy, Book 32, Part 23. When they were asked for their votes, all the other Achaean member states approved by immediate decree a treaty with Attalus and the Rhodians. The treaty with the Romans could not be ratified without the authorization of the Roman people, and so it was postponed until such time as envoys could be sent to Rome. For the time being, it was decided that 3 envoys be dispatched to Lucius Quinctius, and the entire army of the Achaeans be taken to Corinth, where Quinctius, who had now captured Cenchrea, was already laying siege to the city itself. The Achaean army pitched camp in the area of the gate on the Sicyon road. The Romans were concentrating their attack on the part of the city facing Cenchrea, and Attalus, who had brought his army across the isthmus, was attacking from the direction of Lechaeum, a port on the other sea. At first, the attack was conducted in a rather desultory manner, the allies hoping for internal conflict between the inhabitants and the king's garrison. It transpired, however, that the enemy were all of one mind. The Macedonians were defending Corinth as though it were their communal fatherland, and the Corinthians allowed the garrison commander, Androsthenes, to wield his authority over them just as if he were a Corinthian citizen elected by them. Thereafter, all hope for the besieging parties lay in duress, weapons, and siege works. On every side the mounds were being advanced towards the walls, though access was difficult. The battering ram had demolished a section of the wall on the side under attack from the Romans, and because it was denuded of protection, the Macedonians hurriedly converged on that point to defend it with their arms, which gave rise to the ferocious battle between them and the Romans. Initially, the Romans were easily beaten off by superior numbers, but when they enlisted support from the Achaeans and Attalus, they made it an even fight, and in fact there was no doubt that they were easily going to drive back the Macedonians and Greeks from the position. There were, however, large numbers of Italian deserters present. Some had been in Hannibal's army and had followed Philip from fear of retribution from the Romans. Others had been ships, crews who had lately left their fleets and gone over to the enemy in the hope of finding more prestigious service. These men had no hope of salvation in the event of a Roman victory, and this incited them to frenzy rather than reckless defiance. There is a promontory sacred to Juno, titled Acraea, jutting out into the sea opposite Sicyon, from which it is about 7 miles' journey to Corinth. Philocles, who was also an officer of the king, brought 1,500 men through Boeotia to this spot. Philocles, who was also an officer of the king, brought 1,500 men from Boeotia to this spot, where boats from Corinth were waiting to receive these troops and take them across to Lechaeum. Attalus advocated burning the allied siege works and immediately abandoning the siege, but the Roman commander persevered, all the more stubbornly, with the operation. When he saw the king's forces deployed before all the gates, however, and became aware that stemming their counterattacks would not be easy, he conceded that Attalus was right in his opinion. And so, their enterprise aborted, the allies discharged the Achaeans and returned to their ships. Attalus made for Piraeus, and the Romans for Corcyra. 24. During the period of these operations by the navy, the consul established camp in Phocis, near Elatia, and at first tried to achieve his goal by negotiation, engaging the help of the town's chief citizens. Footnote: Phocis, spelled Phocis. End of personal footnote. He was given the reply that any decision was out of their hands, that the king's soldiers were more numerous and stronger than the townspeople. Flaminius then assaulted the city from all directions at once with siege engines and with weaponry. He brought up a battering ram which caused the section of the wall between the towers to collapse with a tremendous crash and rumbling, laying bare the city. A Roman cohort then moved into the city through the passage opened by the recent collapse, and at the same time the defenders all left their post in every sector of the town and quickly converged on the spot that was under pressure from the enemy attack. The Romans were simultaneously clambering over the ruins of the wall and also applying scaling ladders to the ramparts that were still standing. And while the conflict diverted the gaze and attention of the enemy, the wall was taken by means of the scaling ladders at several points, and soldiers climbed over into the city. Hearing the uproar, the enemy were terror-stricken. They abandoned the spot they had been defending en masse, and all sought refuge in the citadel, a crowd of unarmed civilians going with them. Thus the consul occupied the city, and after sacking it, he sent men to the citadel to promise the king's soldiers their lives if they agreed to leave unarmed, and the citizens of Elatia their freedom. Guarantees were given on these terms, and Flaminius took possession of the citadel a few days later. 25. In fact, the arrival in Achaia of Philocles, the king's lieutenant, had an effect beyond the raising of the siege of Corinth. It also led to the betrayal of Philocles of the city-state of Argos. This was done by certain prominent citizens who had first sounded out the feelings of the common people. It was an Argive custom, or Argive, for the magistrates to avert evil omens on the day of an assembly by calling upon Jupiter, Apollo, and Hercules at the start of the proceedings, and by a legal rider, King Philip had been appended to this list. After the treaty was struck with the Romans, the herald failed to add Philip's name to the others, whereupon there was at first a murmuring amongst the crowd, and then an outcry as people supplied Philip's name and insisted that he be accorded the honor legally his, until finally the name was read out to deafening applause. Confident in the support for Philip demonstrated in this way, the prominent citizens summoned Philocles, who by night seized a hill overlooking the city, a citadel, which they call Larissa. Leaving a garrison in place there, Philocles proceeded at dawn in battle formation to the forum which lies beneath the citadel. Here he was met by a line of men drawn up for battle. This was the recently installed Achaean garrison, some 500 young soldiers hand-picked from all the member states and commanded by Anaxidemus of Dymi. A spokesman was sent to these men by the king's officers with orders for them to leave the city. They were no match for the Macedonian sympathizers amongst the citizens of Argos. Even if these latter stood alone, said the spokesman, much less could they match them when they were joined by the Macedonians, whom even the Romans had failed to withstand at Corinth. Personal footnote. The name Anaxidemus is spelt here capital Aenesidemus of Dymi. End of personal footnote. At first the spokesman's words had no effect neither on the commander or his men. Shortly afterwards, however, they saw the Argives approaching in a large column, also under arms, from the opposite direction, and they could see they were facing certain death. Even then, it appeared that they would have been ready to meet any eventuality, and had their leader been more resolute. Unwilling to face the simultaneous loss of the city and the pick of the fighting men of the Achaeans, Anaxidemus struck a bargain with Philocles, which allowed the men to leave. But then, accompanied by a few clients, he personally refused to leave the spot where he had taken up a position under arms. A man was sent by Philocles to inquire what the point of this was. Without changing his position, Anaxidemus stood there with his shield held out before him and replied that he would die under arms defending the city that had been put in his charge. At this, the king's officer issued an order. The Thracians hurled their spears, and the Achaeans were all killed. And so, after a treaty struck between the Achaeans and the Romans, the two most famous cities, Argos and Corinth, remained in the power of the king. Such were the land and sea operations of the Romans in Greece that summer. In Gaul, nothing of particular note was achieved by the consul Sextus Aelius. He had two armies in the province. The first, which should have been demobilized, he had retained. It had been under the command of the proconsul Lucius Cornelius. But Aelius put the praetor Gaius Helvius at its head, and the second he brought with him into the province. Even so, he spent almost the entire year on the enforced repatriation to their colonies of the peoples of Cremona and Placentia, who had been scattered abroad by the tribulations of war. If Gaul that year was surprisingly peaceful, The environs of Rome almost saw a slave revolt. Hostages for the Carthaginians were being kept under guard at Satia, and with them, since they were the children of dignitaries, was a large body of slaves. The total of the latter was being further enhanced, as was to be expected in the aftermath of the recent African war, by numbers of prisoners of war of African stock, who had been bought as slaves from the booty by the people of Setia themselves. In brackets there is a blank. Note it here. End of note. They hatched a plot and sent some of their number to incite to rebellion slaves in the territory of Setia, first of all, and later around Norba and Circeii. With everything now well prepared, they had decided to launch their attack on the people of Setia, when these were engrossed in watching games that were forthcoming in the town. In the bloody and unforeseen uproar, Setia was captured. The slaves then tried to capture Norba and Circeii. Word of this appalling incident was brought to the urban praetor, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, in Rome. 2 slaves came to him before dawn, and gave him a comprehensive account of what had taken place, and what was likely to happen in the future. The praetor ordered the slaves to be kept under guard at his home, convened the Senate, and reported the information brought by the informers. Lentulus was instructed to undertake a mission to investigate the conspiracy and crush it. Setting off with 5 legates, he compelled men whom he came across in the fields to swear the oath of allegiance, take up arms, and follow him. With this makeshift force, some 2,000 armed men, he reached Setia without anyone knowing his destination. There he swiftly arrested the ringleaders of the conspiracy, precipitating a flight from the town by the slaves, and then sent men through the countryside to hunt down fugitives. Sterling service had thus come from 2 slave informers and 1 free man. The Senate ordered that the latter be awarded 100,000 asses, and the Senate ordered the slaves 25,000 asses, each plus their freedom. Their masters were reimbursed for them from the public purse. Not long after this, there was a report that slaves still at large from the same conspiracy were going to seize Praeneste. The praetor, Lucius Cornelius, set off for the town and executed some 500 men who were guilty of involvement. There was fear in the state that the Carthaginian hostages and captives were responsible for these events, and for that reason street patrols were instituted at Rome, with the junior magistrates instructed to make the rounds of these. Furthermore, the triumvirs were ordered to keep a particularly close watch on the quarry prison, and a letter was circulated amongst the Latin allies by the praetor to the effect that the hostages should be confined to private houses and not be permitted access to public places, while prisoners of war should be shackled with chains weighing at least 10 pounds and be kept under guard in the public prisons and nowhere else. (27) The same year, a deputation from Attalus placed a golden crown weighing 246 pounds on the Capitol, and gave thanks to the Senate for the fact that Antiochus had been induced by the authority of Roman embassy to withdraw his army from the territory of Attalus. That same summer, 200 cavalry, 10 elephants, and 200,000 measures of wheat reached the army campaigning in Greece from Massinissa. Large quantities of supplies and clothing for the army were likewise sent from Sicily and Sardinia. Sicily was under the governorship of Marcus Marcellus, and Sardinia under Marcus Porcius Cato. The latter was a man of high principles and integrity, but was considered too severe in his suppression of usury. Money lenders were driven from the island, and allowances given by the allies for the entertainment of the praetors were curtailed or discontinued. On his return from Gaul for the elections, the consul Sextus Aelius pronounced Gaius Cornelius Cethegus and Quintus Minucius Rufus elected consuls. Elections for the praetorship were held 2 days later, and that year, for the first time, 6 praetors were elected. To meet the increase in the number of provinces and the expansion of the empire, the following were elected: Lucius Manlius Vulso, Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus, Marcus Sergius Silus, Marcus Helvius, Marcus Minucius Rufus, and Lucius Attilius, of whom Sempronius and Helvius were plebeian aediles, the curule aediles being Quintus Minucius, Thermus, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus. The Roman games were that year repeated 4 times. 28. When Gaius Cornelius and Quintus Minucius assumed the consulship, the very first piece of business transacted was that of the consulship. The very first piece of business transacted was that of the provinces for the consuls and praetors, and the matter of the praetors, which could be decided by lot, was settled first. Jurisdiction of urban affairs fell to Sergius, that of affairs of resident aliens to Minucius. Attilius was allotted Sardinia, Manlius Sicily, Sempronius hither Spain, and Helvius farther Spain. As the consuls were preparing to draw lots for Italy and Macedonia, the plebeian tribunes Lucius Oppius and Quintus Fulvius interposed an objection, arguing that Macedonia was a distant province, and that down to that time nothing had proved more of an obstacle to the administration of the war than the recall of a consul already in the field, at a point when hostilities had barely commenced, and when his conduct of the campaign was now well under way. It was already 3 years since war had been declared on Macedon, they argued. During that time, Sulpicius had spent most of his year looking for the king and his army. Villius had been recalled just when he was coming to grips with the foe and before he had achieved anything, and Quinctius had been kept back in Rome most of his year for the conduct of religious ceremonies, but had nevertheless achieved such success that he could have finished off the war had he arrived earlier in his province or had winter come later. Now, despite the fact that he had virtually retired into winter quarters, it was reported that his preparations for the war were such that he seemed likely to bring it to an end the next season, if no successor got in his way. With such arguments, the tribunes of the plebs persuaded the consuls to agree to abide by the wishes of the Senate, if the plebeian tribunes themselves did the same. The two sides agreed to give the Senate complete freedom to decide the issue, and the senators determined that both consuls should be given Italy as their province, while they prolonged Titus Quinctius' tenure of command until the arrival of a successor appointed by senatorial decree. The two consuls were each assigned 2 legions, and given the responsibility for conducting a war against the Cisalpine Gauls, who had defected from the Roman people. Quinctius was formally assigned a supplementary force for service in Macedonia, and this comprised 6,000 infantry, 300 cavalry, and 3,000 seamen. Lucius Quinctius Flaminius was instructed to continue as admiral of the fleet which he had been commanding. For the 2 Spains, each of the praetors was granted 8,000 infantry drawn from the allies and the Latin League, and 400 cavalry, so that they could demobilize the veteran troops who had been serving in the Spanish provinces. They were further instructed to define the administrative boundary between the farther and hither provinces. The Senate also appointed Publius Sulpicius and Publius Aemilius, former consuls in the province, as additional legates for Macedonia. Before the departure of the consuls and praetors for their provinces, it was decided that expiatory sacrifices be held for certain prodigies, at whom the temples of Vulcan and Summanus had been struck by lightning, as had a wall and a gate at Freginae. At Frusino, a daylight had shone out in the middle of the night. At Ifula, a lamb had been born with 2 heads and 5 feet. At Formiae, 2 wolves had entered the town and mauled some people they chanced upon, and at Rome a wolf had made its way not just into the city, but even into the capital. The plebeian tribune, Gaius Atinius, proposed a bill for the establishment of 5 colonies on the coast, 2 at the mouths of the rivers Volturnus and Liternus, 1 at Puteoli, and 1 at Castrum, Salerni, with Buxentum added to these as the 5th, and 300 families were to be dispatched to each of these colonies. Marcus Servilius Geminus, Quintus Minucius Thermus, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus were elected triumvirs for a 3-year term in order to found these colonies. After completing the conscription and performing all of the religious and secular duties for which they were responsible, the 2 consuls set off for Gaul. Cornelius took the direct route to the Insubres, who had taken the Cenomani as their allies and were now in armed insurrection. Quintus Minucius headed up the left side of Italy to the Tyrrhenian Sea, where, having led his army to Genoa, he chose the Ligurians as his first adversaries in the war. Clastidium and Litobium, both Ligurian towns, and the Celiates and the Serdiciates, also communities of the same people, surrendered, leaving everything this side of the Po under Roman control, apart from Gallic, Boii, and Ligurian Ilvates. 15 towns and 20,000 men were reported to have surrendered. Minucius then led his legions into the territory of the Boii. 30. Not long before this the army of Boii had crossed the Po and joined up with the Insubres and the Cenomani. They had received word that the consuls had put their legions together to mount their campaign, and they too wanted to strengthen their forces by consolidation. Then a report came that one of the consuls was burning the lands of the Boii, and this immediately precipitated dissension. The Boii insisted that the combined forces bring aid to those in distress, but the Insubres refused to abandon their own property. Their troops, accordingly, separated. The Boii left to protect their farmlands, while the Insubres encamped on the bank of the river Mincius along with the Cenomani. 2 miles downstream from that point, the consul Cornelius pitched camp on the same river. From here, he sent scouts to the Cenoman villages and to Brixia, the tribal capital, and ascertained that the armed uprising of the young warriors had not been sanctioned by the elders, and that it was without public consultation that the Cenomani had joined the uprising of the Insubres. Cornelius summoned their chieftains and proceeded to do all he could to detach the Cenomani from the Insubres, and make them break camp and either go home or transfer their allegiance to the Romans. That end they did not achieve. But the consul was nevertheless given a solemn pledge by the Cenomani that in the battle they would either remain inactive or, if an opportunity arose, help the Romans. The Insubres were ignorant of this compact, and yet they had some suspicion that the loyalty of their allies was flagging. Accordingly, when they led out the troops to battle stations, they did not dare confide either of the wings to the Cenomani, in case they altered the entire fortunes of the encounter by treacherously giving ground, and instead they positioned them in reverse, behind the standards. At the start of the battle, the consul made a vow of a temple to Juno, Sospita, in the event of a defeat and rout of the enemy on that day, and a shout went up from his men to the effect that they would oblige him to discharge the vow. Then the assault was launched on the enemy. The Insubres failed to withstand the first onslaught. Some authorities have it that they were also suddenly attacked in the rear by the Cenomani when the battle was under way, and were thrown into chaos on 2 fronts, that there were 35,000 killed between the 2 lines and 5,200 taken alive, including Hamilcar, the general of the Carthaginians, who had been responsible for the war, and that 130 military standards and more than, there is a blank in brackets, wagons were captured. Towns of the Gauls, which had joined the uprising of the Insubres, surrendered to the Romans. 31. The consul Minucius had at first swept through the lands of the Boii, making raids far and wide, But when the Boii left the Insubres and fell back to protect their own territory, he stuck to his camp in the belief that he ought to meet his enemy in the field. In fact, the Boii would not have refused battle had the report of the defeat of the Insubres not arrived to break their spirit. At this report they abandoned their leader and their camp, and dispersed through the towns in order to defend their individual properties, thus forcing on their enemy a change of strategy for the war. For Minucius now abandoned hope of deciding the issue with a single encounter, and went back to ravaging the fields, burning buildings, and storming towns. During this period, Clastidium was burned. From the Boii, Minucius led his legions against the Ligurian Helvetes, the only tribe refusing submission. But when they heard that the Insubres had been defeated in the field, and that the Boii were so intimidated that they dared not pin their hopes on a battle, this people also submitted to the Romans. Dispatches from the two consuls regarding their respective successes in Gaul were brought to Rome at about the same time. The urban praetor Marcus Sergius read them out in the Senate, and later, on the authority of the Senate, to the people. 4 days of public prayers were enjoined by decree. 32. It was already winter, and after the capture of Elatia, Titus Quinctius had his winter quarters established at various points in Phocis and Locris. That could be, personal footnote, pronounced as Locri as well. Spelled Locris. Meanwhile, civil discord broke out in Opus. One faction called upon the Aetolians, who were closer, the other on the Romans. The Aetolians arrived first, but the wealthier faction shut them out, sent a message to the Roman commander, and held the city until his arrival. The citadel was held by a garrison of the king, which could be constrained to leave it neither by the threats of the people of Opus nor by the authority of the Roman general. An immediate attack was forestalled by the arrival of the herald from Philip requesting a place and date for a meeting, and this was granted to the king with some reluctance. It was not that Quinctius was loath to be seen as having terminated the war by a mixture of armed force and diplomacy. The fact was that he did not yet know whether one of the new consuls was being sent out to succeed him, or whether his command would be extended, a goal which he had instructed his friends and relatives to do their utmost to attain. Still, he felt the meeting would be opportune, giving him latitude to incline towards war if he were staying, or a peace settlement if he were leaving. They chose as a site a beach in the Malayan Gulf near Nicaea, and the king came to this spot from Demetrius with 5 cutters and a warship. With him were leading citizens of Macedonia and a distinguished Achaean exile, Cycliadas. With the Roman commander were Amenander, Dionysidorus, a representative of Attalus, Acesembrotus, admiral of the Rhodian fleet, Phineas, chief of the Aetolians, and 2 Achaeans, Aristaenetus and Xenophon. Surrounded by these, the Roman went forward to the edge of the shore, and the king advanced to the prow of his ship, which lay at anchor. "We could more conveniently talk and listen to each other at close quarters if you disembark," observed the consul. When the king refused to do this, Quintius added, "Whom do you fear, then?" To which Philip replied, with the pride of a king, "I fear no one apart from the immortal gods, but I do not have confidence in the integrity of all the men I see around you, least of all the Aetolians. As far as that is concerned, if trust is lacking, all men who meet to parley with an enemy are exposed to the same danger," said the Roman. "But if treachery is a fit," Titus Quintius replied the king, "Philip and Phineas do not come as equal rewards for duplicity. It would not be as difficult for the Aetolians to find another magistrate as for the Macedonians to find a replacement for me as king." (33) After this there was silence, the Roman thinking it appropriate for the man who had requested the meeting to speak first, and the king that the opening words belonged to the party dictating the terms of peace, not the one being given them. The Roman then said that the statement he had to make was simple, that he would specify only the minimum requirements, without which there could be no peace accord. The king, he continued, had to withdraw his garrisons from all the city-states of Greece, return captives and deserters to the allies of the Roman people, give back to the Romans the regions of Illyricum, which he had occupied subsequent to the peace treaty struck in Epirus, and return to Ptolemy of Egypt the cities which he had seized after the death of Ptolemy Philopater. Such, he said, were his conditions and those of the Roman people, but it was right that Philip listen also to the demands of the Roman allies. Attalus, representative, demanded the return of ships and prisoners taken in the naval engagement off Chios, and the restoration to their original state of the Nicemphorium and the Temple of Venus, both of which Philip had pillaged and reduced to ruin. The Rhodians sought the return of the Piraea, an area on the mainland, facing their island that had been under their sway since days of old, and also made the following demands: the withdrawal of the garrisons from Iasus, Bargellia, and the city of Eromus, as well as from Cestus and Abydos in the Hellespont, the restitution of Perinthus to Byzantium, with restoration of their ancient rights, and the liberation of all the markets and ports of Asia. The Achaeans requested the return of Corinth and Argos. The Aetolian praetor, Phineas, made much the same demands as had the Romans, namely Philip's withdrawal from Greece and the restoration to the Aetolians of the cities formerly under their jurisdiction and control. Phineas's address was followed by an intervention from a leader of the Aetolians, Alexander, who was thought eloquent for an Aetolian. He had been silent a long while. He said not because he felt the meeting was serving any purpose, but so as not to interrupt any of his allies while he was speaking. Philip, he continued, did not conduct peace negotiations with honesty, nor had he ever fought wars with pure courage. In discussion he was always laying traps and scheming in war. Instead of fighting in the open field and engaging his enemy, he would retreat, burning and sacking cities, and conquered himself, ruining the prizes of the conquerors. This was not the way of the Macedonian kings of old. These would fight regular battles and do their best to spare the cities so as to have a richer empire. For what was the sense in destroying what one was fighting to possess and leaving oneself nothing but the act of warfare? Philip had destroyed more cities of his allies in Thessaly in the course of the previous year than all the enemies of Thessaly had ever done in the past. He had also taken more from the Aetolians themselves as an ally than as an enemy. He had seized Lysimachia after driving out its praetor and the Aetolian garrison. He had reduced Cius, also a city under Aetolian control, to a state of total devastation and ruin, and by similar duplicity he now had in his power Thebes of Phthia, Echinus, Larissa, and Pharsalus. 34. Provoked by Alexander's words, Philip brought his ship closer to shore so that he could be clearly heard. He began to speak, aiming his remarks primarily at the Aetolians, but Phineas cut him off sharply, saying that it was not a matter of words. Philip either had to win in the field of battle or do the bidding of his superiors. That, at least, is clear even to a blind man, answered Philip, poking fun at Phineas's eye conditioning. Philip was, in fact, of a wittier disposition than was appropriate for a king, and he did not refrain from joking even in the midst of serious business. Then he proceeded to wax indignant that the Aetolians, like the Romans, were calling for a withdrawal from Greece, though they could not specify what the boundaries of Greece actually were. Even in Aetolia, he said, the Agrii and Apodotai and the Amphilochi, though they represented a large section of the region, were not part of Greece. Are the Aetolians justified in their complaint about my not keeping my hands off their allies? He asked, when they themselves have been observing as a rule from days of old the practice of allowing their men of military age, though without official sanction, to fight against their own allies. And it often emerges that on both sides opposing armies have Aetolian auxiliaries. And it was not I who captured Cius. I helped my ally and friend Prusias when he attacked it. I was the champion of Lysimachia against the Thracians. But the Thracians now hold it because the urgency of my situation diverted my attention from its defense to this particular war. That suffices for the Aetolians. To Attalus and the Rhodians I have no real obligation. The war began with them, not me, but as a mark of respect to the Romans I shall restore both the Piraea to the Rhodians and also the ships to Attalus, along with such captives as come to light. As far as the Nicophorium is concerned, and renovations to the Temple of Venus, all I can say to those demanding their restoration is the following. I shall see to and pay for replantation, the only means by which woods and groves that have been felled can be restored, since such are the demands and responses that kings like to make amongst themselves. The final part of his address was an attack on the Achaeans. After a preamble on the kindnesses shown to that people, first by Antigonus and then by himself, he had their decrees read out containing all manner of divine and human honors that had been paid to him. And he betrayed them for their recent decree, by which they broke with him. After a bitter criticism of their disloyalty, he nonetheless said that he would restore Argos to them. As for Corinth, he would discuss the matter with the Roman commander. and would at the same time ask him whether he thought it right that the king should leave only the cities which he had captured himself, and which he now occupied, by the rules of war, or whether he should also withdraw from those which had been passed down to him by his ancestors. 35. The Achaeans and Aetolians were preparing to respond to his remarks, but since it was close to sunset, the meeting was adjourned till the following day. Philip returned to the naval base from which he had come, and the Romans and their allies to their camp. The next day Quintus came to Nicaea, the rendezvous on which they had agreed, at the prearranged time. But Philip was nowhere to be seen, nor did any messenger come from him over a period of several hours. They were all losing hope of his coming, when his ship suddenly appeared. Philip's explanation was that the demands being made of him were severe and unreasonable, and so, at a loss what to think, he had spent the whole day in deliberation. It was generally believed that Philip had purposely put off the matter until late in the day, so that the Achaeans and Aetolians could not be given time to make their reply to him, and he actually corroborated this view himself by requesting a private discussion with the Roman commander, with the other representatives excluded, so that time would not be wasted in wrangling, and some closure could be set on the business. At first his request was not entertained, so that the allies should not seem excluded from the debate. Philip, however, kept insisting, and so with everybody's approval, the Roman commander, along with the military tribune, Appius Claudius, advanced to the edge of the shore, apart from the others, while the king disembarked with the 2 men he had had with him the previous day. There they conversed in private for some time. The version of the proceedings that Philip took back to his people is not known, but the account Quintius gave to the allies was this. To the Romans, Philip was ceding the entire coastline of Illyricum, and he was also giving back to them deserters and any prisoners he had. To Attalus he was restoring the ships, and the crews he had captured along with them. To the Rhodians he ceded the region called the Perea, but he would not leave Iasus and Bargalea. To the Aetolians he returned to Pharsalus and Larissa, but not Thebes. In the case of the Achaeans he was prepared to withdraw not only from Argos but from Corinth as well. Not one person was satisfied with the areas identified by Philip as those which he would or would not leave. Everyone reckoned that more was being lost than gained, and that unless the king withdrew all his garrisons from Greece, causes for friction would always remain. 36. This was the view expressed by the entire meeting, everyone trying to shout louder than the other, and the noise reached Philip standing in the distance. He therefore asked Quintius for a postponement of the whole question to the following day, saying that he would surely win over the delegates, or allow himself to be won over by them. The beach at Thronium was settled on as the venue, and here they assembled early in the day. At the start of this meeting, Philip asked Quintius and all present not to upset their hopes of peace, and finally he requested time to send a deputation to the Senate in Rome. Either he would gain peace on the conditions already proposed, he said, or he would accept whatever peace terms the Senate dictated. All were entirely opposed to this. Philip was only seeking to delay and postpone matters in order to gather forces, they said. Quintius, however, stated that there would have been some truth in this had it been summer and the campaigning season, but as it was, winter was coming on, and nothing was lost by granting Philip time to send his disputation. No item of any agreement they reached with the king could be ratified without senatorial authorization, he said, and while winter imposed a necessary lull in the fighting, the possibility of the Senate's granting authorization could be explored. All the other Allied leaders supported this view, and so a 2-month truce was granted, and it was decided that they, too, should send one ambassador each to give intelligence to the Senate in case it be taken in by the king's chicanery. A rider that the king's garrisons be immediately withdrawn from Phocis and Locris was added to the terms agreed upon for the truce. To give the deputation a higher profile, Quinctius himself sent Amenander, king of the Athamenes, along with the delegates of the allies, as well as Quintus Fabius, son of the sister of Quinctius's wife, plus Quintus Fulvius and Appius Claudius. 37. When they arrived in Rome, the ambassadors from the allies were granted an audience before those from the king. All of their presentation was taken up with the vituperation of the king. But what especially impressed the Senate was their elucidation of the geography of the area in question, of the sea and the land. This made it clear to everyone that if the king held Demetrius in Thessaly, Chalcis in Euboea, and Corinth in Achaia, Greece could not be free. And Philip himself, the ambassadors noted, used to refer to these cities. And Philip himself, the ambassadors noted, used to refer to these cities as his fetters of Greece, a term as accurate as it was impudent. After this, the king's representatives were brought in. They launched into a long harangue, only to have their speech cut short by a brief question. Would Philip withdraw from these 3 cities? For the representatives admitted that they had no specific instructions with regard to them, and so the king's delegation was discharged with no peace terms concluded, and Quinctius was given a free hand to negotiate peace or make war. It was now quite clear to him that the Senate had not grown weary of the war, and he personally wanted victory more than he wanted peace. Accordingly, he did not, after that, grant Philip a meeting, and he said that he would entertain no deputation from him that did not announce complete withdrawal from Greece. 38. Philip could see the issue had to be decided in battle, and that he needed to concentrate his forces from all quarters. He was concerned above all about the cities of Achaia, an area far separated from him, and more about Argos than he was about Corinth. He concluded that the best idea was to hand over Argos to Nabis, tyrant of Sparta, as a kind of security. Nabis would restore the city to him if the king were victorious, but retain it himself in the event of any mishap befalling him. Philip therefore wrote to Philocles, who was in command of Corinth and Argos, asking him to meet the tyrant in person. Philocles, who was already coming with what was a gift for Nabis, also added the statement that the king wished to give his daughters in marriage to the sons of Nabis, as a guarantee of the friendship between king and tyrant in the future. At first, the tyrant claimed the only condition on which he would accept the city of Argos was if he were invited to give it help by a decree of the Argives themselves. Later he heard that his title, tyrant, had been uttered not only with disrespect, but with hatred, in a crowded assembly, and thinking he now had found a reason for dispossessing the Argives, he told Philocles to hand over the city whenever he wished. The tyrant was let into the city at night without anyone knowing, and at dawn all the more elevated areas of the town had been seized by him and the gates closed. A few of the most important citizens had slipped away in the initial commotion, and their valuables were pillaged in their absence. Those who remained found themselves despoiled of their gold and silver and subjected to huge fines. Those who unhesitatingly brought out their property were let off without abuse and physical maltreatment. But people suspected of hiding or holding back anything were thrashed and tortured like slaves. Nabis then called an assembly at which he proposed two bills, one on the cancellation of debts, and the second on the redistribution on the Nabis then called an assembly at which he composed two bills, one on the cancellation of debts, and the second on redistributing land to individual citizens, thereby providing two torches for revolutionaries to inflame the proletariat against the nobles. 39. After the city of Argos was in his hands, the tyrant gave no thought whatsoever to the man from whom he had received it, and the conditions on which he had done so. He sent a delegation to Quinctius in Elatia and to Attalus, who was in winter quarters at Aegina, to report that Argos was now in his control. If Quinctius came to parley with him there, he said, he was sure they could reach a full agreement. Wishing to deprive Philip of his stronghold, too, Quinctius agreed to come, and he sent word to Attalus asking him to come from Aegina to Sicyon to meet him. He then crossed from Anticyra to Sicyon with 10 quinqueremes, which his brother Lucius Quinctius had happened to bring with him during those very days from his winter quarters in Corcyra. Attalus was already in Sicyon. He expressed the view that the tyrant should come to the Roman commander, not the Roman to the tyrant, and he won Quinctius over to his opinion, persuading him not to go to the city of Argos itself. A place called Seneca lies not far from the city, and it was agreed that the meeting be held there. Quinctius arrived with his brother and a few military tribunes, Attalus with his royal train of attendants, and Nicostratus, praetor of the Achaeans, with a few auxiliary soldiers. They found the tyrant awaiting them there with all his troops. Nabis, in armor himself and attended by armed bodyguards, advanced close to the midpoint of the field, separating the parties. Quinctius, accompanied by his brother and 2 of the military tribunes, was unarmed, and the king, with the praetor of the Achaeans and 1 of his courtiers at his side, was also unarmed. The conversation opened with an apology from the tyrant for coming to the meeting armed himself, and encircled by armed men, when he saw that the Roman commander and the king were unarmed. It was not them he feared, he said, it was the Argive exiles. Then discussion of the terms of alliance began, and the Roman demanded 2 things of Nabis. First, cessation of hostilities with the Achaeans, and secondly, that the tyrant sent auxiliary troops with him against Philip. The latter Nabis agreed to send, but instead of peace with the Achaeans, Flaminius gained from him a truce until the time that the war with Philip should be finished. 40. The Argive question was also raised by Attalus. He asserted that the city had been betrayed to Nabis through treachery on Philocles' part, and was now being held by him under duress. Nabis defended himself by saying that he had been called upon by the Argives themselves. The king insisted upon a meeting of the Argive assembly so that this could be established, and the tyrant did not object. However, the king asserted that Nabis's garrison should be withdrawn from the city, and that the Argives given the opportunity of a free assembly, with no Spartans present, which would reveal the true wishes of the people of Argos. The tyrant refused to withdraw his men, and further discussion proved ineffectual. The meeting then adjourned, with the Roman granted 600 Cretan soldiers by the tyrant, and the truce of 4 months' duration arranged between Nicostratus, praetor of the Achaeans, and the tyrant of the Lacedaemonians. Quinctius then set off for Corinth, and came up to the gate with his Cretan battalion, to make it clear to Philocles, in command of the city, that the tyrant had abandoned Philip. Philocles also came to confer with the Roman commander, who urged him to desert Philip immediately and deliver the city to him. Philocles so worded his reply as to give the impression of having postponed a decision rather than refused outright. Quinctius crossed from Corinth to Anticyra, and from there he sent his brother to try to win over the support of the people of Acarnania. Attalus headed for Sicyon from Argos. Here the city added fresh hours to the former ones they had made to the king, and Attalus, who had in the past paid an enormous sum of money to redeem the holy precinct of Apollo for the people of Sicyon, did not wish to lose his second occasion to show his generosity to a city-state that was his ally and friend. He made the city a gift of 10 talents of silver and 10,000 bushels of grain. After this, he returned to his fleet at Cenchreae. Nabis, for his part, strengthened the garrison at Argos, and returned to Sparta. He had already despoiled the men of Argos himself, and now he sent his wife back to the city to despoil the women. She brought the ladies of note into her presence, neither individually or in family groups, and by a combination of flattery and menaces deprived them not only of their gold, but eventually even of their clothing and all their feminine accessories. End of Book 32.